There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, a Tuesday evening barely distinguishable from the hundred that came before it. They were the camouflage of routine, of soft lighting and the low hum of a refrigerator, and they slip past your defenses. You only recognize them in retrospect, as the quiet fulcrum upon which your entire world tilted. For me, that moment was the sound of a question, a gentle inquiry that carried the weight of a tectonic shift. It was not a grand declaration or a dramatic confession, but a simple, hesitant collection of words spoken into the shared space between us on my worn leather couch. He said he didn't want the night to end, and then he asked if he could stay a bit longer. In that question, I felt the delicate architecture of my carefully constructed life begin to tremble, threatening to collapse into a beautiful, terrifying ruin. The silence that followed his words was not empty. It was thick with everything we had never said, a pressurized atmosphere that made the simple act of breathing feel deliberate and loud. Liam was looking at me, his head propped on the armrest, his body stretched out across the cushions that had long since molded to the shape of his exhaustion. The television was still on, casting flickering blue light across his face, catching in the strands of his dark hair and illuminating the genuine weariness in his eyes. He had been a constant presence in my apartment for months, a fixture of my evenings. But this was different. This was a deviation from the script we had been unconsciously following, a quiet ad-lib that changed the meaning of the entire play. My heart, a frantic bird trapped in my chest, hammered against my ribs, each beat a panicked question. What does he mean? What does he really mean? I had spent years becoming a master archivist of his smallest gestures, his fleeting expressions, the subtle shifts in his tone. I could read him like a well-loved book, but this new chapter was written in a language I didn't understand, and the fear of misinterpretation was a cold knot in my stomach. He was waiting for an answer, his gaze steady and patient, and I realized I had been silent for too long. My mind raced through 1,000 possible responses, each one a door to a different future. I could make a joke, deflect with easy humor, and guide us back to the safe, familiar territory of our friendship. I could feign tiredness myself, a gentle dismissal that would preserve the status quo and guarantee that I would spend the rest of the night staring at my ceiling, dissecting my own cowardice. Or I could say yes, a simple, one-word answer that felt like stepping off a cliff in the dark, trusting that something, or someone, would be there to catch me. The air in the room seemed to thin, and I focused on the small details to anchor myself. The frayed seam on the couch cushion beneath my hand, the faint scent of rain from the open window, the way the light carved a sharp line along his jaw. He was my best friend. He was the unshakable center of my small world. And he was asking for something more, even if he didn't know it. Or maybe, and this was the thought that both thrilled and terrified me, maybe he knew exactly what he was asking. Yeah, I finally managed to say, my voice sounding rougher, lower than usual. Of course, to understand the sheer magnitude of that quiet exchange, you would have to understand the landscape of the years that preceded it. You would have to understand Liam. He had entered my life during college, a supernova of easy confidence and loud laughter in the muted, gray halls of the arts building. I was a photography student, most comfortable behind a lens, observing the world from a safe and curated distance. He was a software engineering major who had somehow ended up in a mandatory visual arts elective, complaining loudly to anyone who would listen that he dealt in logic and code, not in light and shadow. He was all kinetic energy, a whirlwind of social engagements and athletic commitments, while I existed in a state of deliberate stillness. We were, by any measure, an improbable pair. Our friendship should have been a temporary collision, a brief intersection of two wildly different orbits, but somehow, it wasn't. It began with a shared darkroom session. I was meticulously developing a series of black and white portraits, lost in the patient alchemy of the process, the gentle sloshing of chemicals, and the slow emergence of an image under the dim red safety light. Liam burst in, a chaotic force in that quiet, sacred space, having completely botched his assignment. He had exposed his film to light, mixed his chemicals in the wrong order, and was holding a set of completely blank photographic paper with an expression of pure, unadulterated frustration. He looked so out of his element, so genuinely defeated, that for the first time, his bravado seemed to crack. I saw past the outgoing athlete, the life of the party, and saw someone who was simply lost. Something in me, the quiet observer who rarely intervened, felt a strange pull to help. I spent the next 3 hours walking him through the process, step by step, my voice hushed in the dim light, our hands occasionally brushing as we handled the delicate paper and tongs. He listened. That was the first thing that surprised me about him. For all his outward bluster, he had an incredible capacity for stillness when he was genuinely interested in something. He watched my hands with an intensity one hadn't expected, asked thoughtful questions, and absorbed every word. By the end of the night, he had a single, passable photograph, a blurry, slightly overexposed shot of a campus statue, but he held it as if it were a masterpiece. He looked at me, a real, unguarded smile spreading across his face, and the force of it felt like a physical blow. "You're a lifesaver, Ethan," he'd said, his voice echoing slightly in the tiled room. "Seriously, I owe you 1 inch." From that night on, the orbits of our lives began to slowly, irrevocably merge. He started seeking me out, finding me in the library where I'd be buried in books, or in my usual corner of the campus coffee shop. He'd bring me coffee, plop down across from me, and fill the quiet space I cultivated with stories of his coding projects, his rugby practice, his impossibly complicated family dynamics. I became his confidant, his quiet harbor. He seemed to crave the stillness I offered, a counterbalance to his own relentless energy. And I, in turn, found myself drawn to his warmth, his effortless light. He pulled me out of my shell, coaxing me into social situations I would have normally avoided, introducing me to his wide circle of friends as Ethan, the genius artist who saved my grade. They were all like him, bright and boisterous, and I often felt like a foreign exchange student in their world, observing their rituals with a kind of anthropological fascination. But with Liam, it was different. When he was with me, he was calmer, more reflective. He would come to my small, off-campus apartment, a space I kept as meticulously composed as one of my photographs, and he would just be. We would listen to music, watch old movies, or sometimes just sit in comfortable silence, the unspoken understanding between us a tangible thing. It was during one of those quiet evenings, about a year into our friendship, that I understood the true and terrifying nature of my feelings for him. He was lying on my floor, mapping out some complex algorithm on a piece of scrap paper, his brow furrowed in concentration. The late afternoon sun streamed through the window, dust motes dancing in the golden light, and it caught in his hair, turning the dark strands to bronze. He looked up at me suddenly, a question about his project on his lips, but the words died when he saw the look on my face. I was just watching him, and my expression must have held a sort of unguarded reverence, a tenderness that was too honest to hide. A flicker of confusion crossed his features before he smiled, a little uncertainly, and looked back down at his paper. In that moment, the bottom dropped out of my world. It was a love so profound, so absolute. It felt like a fundamental part of my own biology, like the marrow in my bones. And it was a love that I was certain could never be returned. Liam was a creature of sunshine and easy affection, but his world was one populated by girlfriends with bright smiles and easy grace. He was my best friend, and I knew, with a certainty that felt like a cold stone in my gut, that telling him the truth would be like setting a torch to the beautiful, fragile sanctuary we had built together. So I buried it. I packed it down deep, built walls of casual friendship around it, and became an expert in the art of loving from a safe distance. The years after college only deepened our bond. We ended up in the same city, a happy coincidence that felt more like destiny. I pursued my photography, taking on freelance work, slowly building a portfolio, while he was immediately snapped up by a fast-paced tech firm. His life was a whirlwind of deadlines, business trips, and corporate expectations. My life was a quiet routine of light and shadow, of waiting for the perfect moment to press the shutter. Our friendship became an anchor for us both. My apartment was his decompression chamber. He would show up at my door, often late at night, his tie loosened, the crisp lines of his work shirt softened with weariness. He would collapse onto my couch, shedding the armor of his professional life, and for a few hours, he would just be Liam. He dated a woman named Sarah for a while, a relationship that, from my vantage point, seemed more like a merger than a romance. She was smart, ambitious, and fit perfectly into the life he was supposed to want. I was polite and friendly whenever I saw her, a performance of detached amiability that deserved an award. Inside, I felt like a ghost at their table, watching the man I loved build a life with someone else. Then came the shift. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic event, but a slow, creeping change in the emotional weather between us. His relationship with Sarah ended, not with a bang, but with a quiet, mutual fizzle. He told me about it one evening, staring into a glass of whiskey he held in his hands, his voice devoid of any real heartbreak. It was more like a project that had failed to launch, a business deal that had fallen through. There was disappointment, but no real pain. We just wanted different things, he said, shrugging. Or maybe we wanted the same things, but not with each other. I just listened, offering quiet support, careful to keep the surge of treacherous hope I felt from showing on my face. It was after the breakup that his presence in my apartment became less of a visit and more of a default state. The catalyst wasn't just the end of his relationship. It was a period of intense pressure at his job. They were launching a massive new product, and Liam was at the heart of it. The work consumed him. He grew thinner. The shadows under his eyes became a permanent feature, and the bright energy that had always defined him seemed to dim, like a battery running low. He started showing up at my door not just tired, but utterly depleted. He wouldn't even talk much at first. He would just walk in, drop his bag by the door, and fall onto the couch as if his strings had been cut. I would make him tea, or pour him a drink, and sit in my armchair, the quiet observer once more, watching over him. I learned the different textures of his exhaustion. There was the wired, frantic exhaustion of a day filled with too much caffeine and too many meetings, and there was the deep, bone-weary exhaustion of a soul-crushing defeat. I learned to simply be a quiet presence, a port in his storm. I never pushed him to talk. I just let the silence hold him, let my calm space be a balm for his frayed nerves. He was seeking a new kind of comfort from me, a level of quiet intimacy that went beyond our established friendship. He was leaning on me in a way he never had before, and the lines we had drawn so carefully around our relationship began to blur, softened by his weariness and my silent, patient love. That was the context. That was the long, winding road that led us to that Tuesday evening, to him stretched out on my couch, the blue light of the television flickering across his tired face. His request to stay was not just a question about the next few hours. It was a question about the nature of our sanctuary. It was a test of the boundaries I had so painstakingly maintained for years. And when I said yes, it felt like I had finally, after years of standing on the shore, allowed myself to be pulled into the current, unsure of where it would take me, but no longer willing to fight the tide. His expression softened with a relief that was so palpable it was almost a sound. A small, grateful smile touched his lips. "Thanks, Ethan," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. He shifted on the couch, pulling a throw blanket over himself, and within minutes, the steady, rhythmic sound of his breathing filled the quiet room. I stayed in my armchair for a long time, watching him sleep. The television show ended, the credits rolled, and the screen went black, plunging the room into a deeper darkness, broken only by the thin sliver of moonlight coming through the window. In the quiet, my thoughts were a chaotic storm. This was the beginning of the ritual. The first few times, it was always the couch. He'd work late, text me that he was too drained to make the 40-minute drive back to his own sterile, empty apartment on the other side of the city, and ask if he could crash. It became a pattern. 2, then 3, then 4 nights a week. I would come home to find him already there, having let himself in with the spare key I'd given him years ago, an object that had once been for emergencies but had now become a tool of routine. He would be asleep on the sofa, still in his work clothes, his laptop open on the coffee table, a testament to his Sisyphean struggle against his deadlines. I would gently take off his shoes, cover him with a blanket, and retreat to my own room, the closed door between us feeling like a physical representation of the line I was so afraid to cross. I would lie awake for hours, acutely aware of his presence just one room away. The knowledge that he was there, safe and asleep under my roof, was a source of both profound comfort and exquisite agony. The ritual evolved one rainy Thursday night. He had arrived later than usual, soaked to the bone and shivering, his face pale with a fatigue that seemed to go deeper than just a lack of sleep. He had barely spoken, just stripped off his wet coat and collapsed onto the couch. I was in my room, trying to read, but the sound of his restless shifting and quiet groans of discomfort kept pulling my attention. Finally, I went out into the living room. He was curled into a tight ball, his long frame cramped by the sofa's limitations, the thin blanket doing little to ward off the chill. He looked miserable. "You can't sleep like that," I said, my voice softer than I intended. He opened his eyes, and they looked glassy and unfocused. "My back is killing me," he mumbled. This couch was not designed for a 6'2" software engineer. A ghost of his usual humor flickered and died. I hesitated for only a moment. The thought that bloomed in my mind was both dangerous and inevitable. You can take my bed," I offered. "I can take the couch." He immediately shook his head, a gesture that seemed to cost him a significant amount of energy. "No way. I'm not kicking you out of your own bed." "That's ridiculous." He tried to sit up and winced, a sharp intake of breath betraying his pain. The internal debate was swift and decisive. My fear of blurring the lines was eclipsed by the simple, undeniable need to care for him. "It's a king-sized bed, Liam," I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. "It's big enough for an army. Just come on. You need to sleep." I didn't wait for another protest. I walked back to my bedroom, pulled back the covers on the side of the bed farthest from the door, and left the lamp on my nightstand on, a small beacon in the dark. A few minutes later, he appeared in the doorway, a silhouette against the faint light of the living room. He looked uncertain, vulnerable, like a traveler who had stumbled upon an unexpected shelter and wasn't sure if he was welcome to enter. "Are you sure about this?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I just nodded, not trusting my own voice. He padded silently into the room, stripped down to his t-shirt and boxers with an unself-conscious familiarity that made my breath catch in my throat, and slid into the bed. He stayed rigidly on his side, a clear foot of empty space between us, as if an invisible wall stood there. I turned off the light and got into my own side, my body tense, my senses on high alert. The room was dark, but it felt charged with a new, potent energy. I could feel the heat radiating from his body across the small distance. I could hear the soft sound of his every breath. I could smell the faint, familiar scent of his shampoo on the pillow. It was an intimacy so intense it was almost unbearable. I lay perfectly still, my back to him, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against the mattress. Sleep felt like an impossible dream. "Ethan," his voice, a low murmur in the darkness, made me jump. "Yeah," I whispered back, my own voice tight. "Thank you," he said. And in those two words, I heard not just gratitude for the bed, but for everything. For the quiet, for the safety, for the unspoken sanctuary I provided. "Good night, Liam," I replied, the words feeling heavy and inadequate. He was asleep within minutes, his exhaustion finally claiming him. His breathing deepened, and at some point in the night, the rigid line he had maintained between us dissolved. In his sleep, he rolled over, his arm falling across my waist, his face pressing into my back. My entire body went rigid, every nerve ending fired at once. His touch was an electric current, a brand of heat and weight that I had only ever imagined. I lay there, trapped and liberated all at once, not daring to move, not daring to breathe. It was the purest form of torture and the most profound moment of peace I had ever known. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just lay there, a living statue, memorizing the weight of his arm, the warmth of his breath on my neck, committing every sensation to the permanent archive of my memory. This became the new ritual. The couch was forgotten. His pretext was always plausible: a bad back, a long week, the promise of a more comfortable sleep. But we both knew, on some unspoken level, that it was more than that. He was seeking a closeness that he couldn't or wouldn't name, and I was granting it, too afraid of losing him to question the fragile, unspoken arrangement. Night after night, we would lie in the dark, separated by a chasm of silence and unspoken feelings, and night after night, in the unconscious honesty of sleep, he would close the distance. He would find me in the dark, his body seeking mine as if drawn by a magnetic force. A hand on my chest, a leg tangled with mine, his head resting on my shoulder. Each touch was a secret confession whispered in the language of sleep, a confession that would be erased by the morning light. When we woke up, We would be on our respective sides of the bed again, the invisible wall rebuilt, the night's intimacy a shared, unacknowledged dream. We never spoke of it. We would get up, make coffee, and talk about his work, my latest photo shoot, the weather, anything but the fact that we had spent the night wrapped around each other. The plausible deniability was our shield, protecting us both from the terrifying truth of what was happening between us. For me, this ritual was a slow, agonizing process of hope and despair. I would spend my days in a state of heightened awareness, analyzing every word he said, every look he gave me, searching for any sign that his conscious mind was catching up to his unconscious one. I was living in a liminal space, a gray area between friendship and something more, and the uncertainty was hollowing me out. I felt like I was developing a photograph in slow motion, watching the image of us emerge, faint and uncertain. I was terrified of exposing it to the light too soon, of fixing the image before it was fully formed, of ruining it forever. But the chemical bath of our nightly proximity was changing us both, whether we were ready to admit it or not. The tension was building, a static charge in the air of my small apartment, and I knew, with a growing sense of dread and anticipation, that something would have to break. The breaking point arrived on a Saturday. It was different from the usual weeknights. There was no excuse of work-related exhaustion. He had come over in the afternoon, ostensibly to help me build a set of shelves, but we had ended up just talking, ordering pizza, and watching a marathon of old black and white movies. The day had a soft, domestic quality to it, a feeling of settled comfort that was both new and ancient. As night fell, a quiet understanding passed between us. He wasn't going home. He didn't even offer a pretext this time. It was simply a given. We finished the last movie, and the familiar silence descended, but tonight it felt different. It was heavier, charged with a new level of intention. He didn't move to the bedroom. He just stayed on the couch, watching me as I cleared away the pizza boxes. "I don't want a night to end," he said, his voice quiet but clear in the still room. It was the same line that had started this all, but this time it felt less like a question and more like a statement of fact. "It doesn't have to," I replied, my voice equally soft. He looked at me, his gaze intense, searching. It felt as if he was finally seeing me, not just as his friend, his safe harbor, but as something else. The carefully constructed walls between us seemed to dissolve, leaving us exposed and vulnerable in the flickering blue light of the television's menu screen. The air grew thick, and I could hear my own pulse drumming in my ears. This was it, the moment of exposure, the point where the image would either fix or fade to black. He sat up slowly, swinging his legs off the couch to face me. The space between us was now only a few feet, a chasm that felt both impossibly wide and easily crossed. "Ethan," he began, and then stopped, swallowing hard. He seemed to be wrestling with a thought, his brow furrowed. He looked down at his hands, then back up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and a desperate, raw honesty. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything," I breathed, the word a promise. He held my gaze, and the world seemed to narrow to the space between us, to the question I could see forming in his eyes before he even spoke the words. "Would it be okay," he said, his voice a strained whisper, "if I kissed you?" The question hung in the air, a perfect, fragile thing. It was not a proposition, not a move, but a plea for permission. It was an offering of his own vulnerability, a confession of a desire he seemed to be discovering at the same moment he was articulating it. All the nights of agonizing silence, of accidental touches in the dark, of unspoken longing, all of it coalesced into this single, terrifying, beautiful moment. My answer was not a word. It was the small, almost imperceptible nod of my head. It was the way I closed the distance between us, kneeling on the floor in front of the couch so that our faces were level. It was the way my eyes fluttered shut as he leaned in. His lips were tentative at first, a soft, questioning pressure against mine. It was a kiss of pure discovery, hesitant and achingly gentle. There was no practiced confidence, no easy passion. It was clumsy and perfect and honest. It was the taste of salt and uncertainty and a hope so fierce it felt like pain. He pulled back slightly, his eyes searching mine, as if to make sure this was real, that he hadn't crossed a line I hadn't wanted him to. I gave him the only answer I could. I leaned back in, my hand coming up to cup the back of his neck, my fingers tangling in his soft hair, and I kissed him back. I poured every unspoken word, every year of silent, patient love into that single, desperate gesture. It was a conversation we had been waiting our whole lives to have, and it was happening now, in the quiet of my living room, without a single word being spoken. When we finally broke apart, we just stayed there for a long moment, our foreheads resting against each other, our breaths mingling in the small space between us. The silence that returned was not the tense, questioning silence of before. It was a new kind of quiet, one filled with a fragile, shimmering peace. He had crossed the line. We had crossed it together. And on the other side, I found not the ruin I had feared, but the beginning of a foundation I had never dared to hope for. The ritual of the open door and the unspoken invitation had ended. A new one of honest, intentional closeness, was just beginning. The morning after was a study in shattered peace. I woke up alone. The space beside me in the bed was cool to the touch, the sheets smooth and undisturbed. For a disoriented moment, I thought I might have dreamed it all. The hushed question, the tentative kiss that had deepened into something solid and real, the way we had eventually moved to the bedroom and fallen asleep in each other's arms, not as a matter of unconscious drift, but as a deliberate choice. But then I saw it. The indentation of his head on the other pillow, a faint ghost of his presence. He was gone. He had slipped out in the pale, pre-dawn light, leaving behind nothing but a profound and echoing silence. The fragile peace of the night before evaporated, replaced by a cold, creeping anxiety that coiled in my stomach. My first instinct was to rationalize. He had an early meeting. He didn't want to wake me. He was just being considerate. But my mind, a well-trained machine for worst-case scenarios, quickly discarded these comforting lies. This felt different. This felt like a retreat. I reached for my phone, my hand trembling slightly. No text. No missed call. Just the stark, empty screen. I sent a simple message, my thumb hovering over the send button for a long time before I finally pressed it. Hey, are you okay? The hours that followed were agonizing. The single gray checkmark next to my message remained stubbornly singular. It hadn't even been delivered. His phone was off. My apartment, which had been a sanctuary for so long, suddenly felt like a cage. Every object was a reminder of him. The coffee mug he always used, the throw blanket he'd curled up under, the faint scent of him that still lingered on my pillows. I was adrift in a sea of evidence of an intimacy that might have been a mistake. The silence stretched through the day, a taut wire of suspense. I tried to work, to edit the photos from my latest shoot, but the faces on the screen were just blurs. My focus was entirely consumed by the void he had left behind. Had I misread everything? Had the kiss been a moment of confused, exhaustion-fueled curiosity for him, while for me it had been the culmination of a decade of silent devotion? The thought was a physical pain, a sharp, twisting sensation in my chest. I had allowed myself to hope, to step off the cliff, and now I was in freefall, with no ground in sight. The fear that I had not just misinterpreted the moment, but that I had ruined the most important friendship of my life, was overwhelming. The sanctuary was in flames, and I was the one who had handed him the match. Finally, late in the afternoon, my phone buzzed. A text from him. My heart leaped into my throat. I fumbled with the phone, my hands slick with nervous sweat. The message was short, clinical, and utterly devastating. Sorry. Crazy day. Swamped at work, that was it. No mention of the night before. No acknowledgement of the tectonic shift that had occurred between us. It was a deliberate, calculated act of erasure. He was trying to put things back in the box, to pretend the line had never been crossed. And in that moment, my anxiety curdled into a cold, quiet anger. It wasn't just about the kiss. It was about the months of him seeking refuge in my bed, the unspoken intimacy he had initiated, the way he had leaned on my silent strength. He didn't get to use me as his emotional lifeboat, and then pretend he had never been at sea. I spent the next 2 days in a state of suspended animation, waiting. He kept his distance. His texts were sporadic and painfully polite, filled with corporate jargon and vague excuses about deadlines. He was building a wall, brick by digital brick, and I was watching him do it, feeling utterly powerless. The quiet observer in me was screaming. For years, I had been content to watch, to analyze, to understand him from a distance. But he had invited me in. He had closed the door behind us, and now he was trying to pretend that room had never existed. The pain of it was sharp, but beneath the pain was a new, unfamiliar resolve. I would not let him erase us. I would not let my love for him, or his confusion, turn our story into a ghost. On the third day, I couldn't take it anymore. The not knowing was worse than any possible truth. I drove to his apartment. I had only been there a handful of times. It was a sterile, impersonal space in a modern high-rise, the polar opposite of the warm, lived-in chaos of my own place. It was a place for him to sleep, not to live. Standing outside his door, my heart hammered against my ribs. This was the real leap of faith. Not the kiss, but this. The confrontation. The demand for honesty. I knocked, my knuckles rapping sharply against the wood. The door opened, and he stood there, looking hollowed out. He was still in his work clothes, but they were rumpled, and he hadn't shaved. He looked worse than he had on his most exhausting nights at my place. He saw me, and a wave of something, panic, guilt, relief, washed over his face. He didn't seem surprised to see me, as if he had been expecting this moment and dreading it. "Ethan," he said, his voice a rough whisper. He didn't invite me in. He just stood there, blocking the doorway, a human barrier. "We need to talk, Liam," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "You can't just disappear. You don't get to do that. Not after." I trailed off, the words catching in my throat. He finally stepped back, a gesture of defeat, and I walked into the apartment. The air was stale, the blinds were drawn, and takeout containers were piled on the counter. It was the apartment of someone who was hiding. I turned to face him, my arms crossed over my chest, a defensive posture I didn't even realize I was taking. "What happened?" I asked, the question blunt and stripped of all subtlety. "What are you doing?" He wouldn't meet my eyes. He paced the small living room, running a hand through his already messy hair. "I don't know," he muttered, his back to me. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. That night was a mistake." The word mistake landed like a punch to the gut. All the air rushed out of my lungs. I had prepared myself for confusion, for fear, but not for this. Not for a complete negation of what had felt so real, so right. "A mistake," I repeated, my voice dangerously quiet. "The whole night? Or just the part where you kissed me? Or was it the months you spent sleeping in my bed, holding on to me like I was the only solid thing in your world? Which part was the mistake, Liam? Please, be specific." He finally stopped pacing and turned to face me, and his eyes were filled with a desperate, frantic anguish. This wasn't the calm, confident Liam I knew. This was someone I had never seen before, someone completely undone. "All of it. I don't know," he burst out, his voice cracking. "I'm so confused, Ethan. I don't feel this way. I don't do this. I'm not." He couldn't even say the word. He gestured vaguely with his hands, a picture of helpless frustration. "My whole life, there's been a path, you know? A plan. College, job, girlfriend, house. It's all laid out. And you're not on the path. What we did, it's not on the map." The dam of his composure broke, and the words came pouring out, a torrent of fear and confusion. He confessed that he had been running from his own loneliness for years, filling his life with noise and work and relationships that looked right on paper but felt empty inside. He said that my apartment, my quiet presence, had been the only place he felt he could breathe, the only place he didn't have to perform. He admitted that the comfort he found with me had slowly, insidiously, morphed into something else, something deeper and more terrifying. The kiss hadn't been a mistake. It had been an inevitability he had been fighting against for months, and it scared him to death. He was terrified of what it meant, of what people would think, of how it would change his life, of how it would change his own perception of himself. He had run away not from me, but from the terrifying, exhilarating truth that the kiss had revealed. I listened to his confession, my own anger slowly dissolving, replaced by a profound, aching empathy. He wasn't rejecting me. He was rejecting a part of himself he didn't understand and didn't know how to accept. He was a man who had built his life on logic and clear directives, and he had stumbled into the messy, illogical, beautiful chaos of love. He had finally finished speaking and was just standing there, breathing heavily, looking at me with raw, pleading eyes, waiting for me to fix it, to tell him what to do. The quiet observer had to become the guide. I walked over to him, closing the space between us once more. I didn't touch him. I just stood in front of him and met his gaze, holding it until he stopped looking so lost. "There is no map, Liam," I said, my voice soft but firm. "There's no path. We're all just making it up as we go along. We're all just looking for a place to feel safe. A place to be ourselves." I took a deep breath, preparing to lay my own heart bare, to offer him the one thing I had. "You said what we did isn't on your map. But for me, for a very long time, you have been the map. You have been the destination." A tear traced a path down his cheek, a single, silent drop of surrender. "I'm scared," he whispered, the admission costing him everything. "I know," I said, and this time, I did reach out, my hand resting gently on his arm. "Me too. But maybe we can be scared together." That conversation in his stark, lonely apartment was the true beginning. It was not the romantic climax of a movie. It was something far more real and vital. It was the painful, necessary work of tearing down old structures to build something new. We talked for hours, the drawn blinds of his apartment creating a timeless cocoon around us. He spoke of the pressures he'd always felt, the expectations he'd internalized from his family, from society, from himself. He described his identity as a kind of armor he'd been wearing for so long he'd forgotten it wasn't his own skin. The feelings he had for me were a crack in that armor, a terrifying vulnerability that threatened his entire sense of self. He had been seeking physical proximity to me for months, not just for comfort, but as a way to unconsciously explore this new, uncharted emotional territory in the safety of the dark, under the guise of plausible deniability. The kiss had been the moment the sun came up, forcing him to look at the new landscape he had woken up in, and he had panicked. I, in turn, told him everything. I laid out the long, quiet history of my love for him, not as an accusation, but as a context. I told him about the day in college when the afternoon sun had caught his hair, about the years of watching him with a quiet, hopeless ache, about the terror and joy of our shared nights. I explained that my silence had been its own form of armor, a way to protect our friendship, which I valued more than my own hope. By laying our fears and our histories bare, we drained the poison from the wound. The ambiguity that had been both a comfort and a torment was replaced by the stark, terrifying, and ultimately liberating clarity of the truth. There was no going back to the way things were. The old friendship, with its carefully maintained boundaries and unspoken truths, was gone forever. The question was what, if anything, we would build in its place. We didn't solve everything in one night. The resolution was not a sudden epiphany, but a slow, deliberate process of healing and discovery. It was a series of small, intentional choices. It began with me staying the night at his apartment, reversing our long-standing ritual. We lay in his bed, the unfamiliar territory making the intimacy feel new and deliberate. This time, when he reached for me in the dark, it was not an unconscious act. It was a choice. His hand found mine, his fingers lacing with my own, a silent, binding contract. We didn't talk much more that night. The words had been said. Now was the time for a new kind of silence, a comfortable, honest silence, built on a foundation of shared vulnerability. The days that followed were tentative, like the first days of spring after a long, hard winter. We were learning a new language, a new way of being with each other. A casual touch on the arm was no longer accidental. It was a deliberate act of affection. A shared look across a room was filled with a new, shared meaning. We were mapping out our new world together, one small step at a time. He started spending his nights at my place again, but the dynamic had fundamentally changed. There were no more pretexts. He stayed because he wanted to be with me. The door to my bedroom was no longer left symbolically ajar. It was a space we entered together. The king-sized bed no longer felt like two separate territories with a contested border. It was a shared space, an island we inhabited jointly. One of the most profound changes was in him. As he began to let go of the rigid map he had been following, a lighter, more authentic version of Liam began to emerge. The frantic energy that had been fueled by anxiety was replaced by a calmer, more centered presence. He smiled more, a genuine, unguarded smile that reached his eyes. He started talking about things he actually wanted, not things he thought he should want. He even dug out his old, blurry photograph from our college darkroom class and framed it, placing it on his nightstand. A reminder, he told me. of where the better path started. He was healing, and I was not just his sanctuary anymore. I was his partner in that healing. The final piece of the old architecture to be dismantled was the couch. For months, it had been the stage for our nightly drama of unspoken needs. One Saturday, we were rearranging my living room, a simple domestic act that felt momentous. We stood on opposite ends of the heavy leather sofa, preparing to move it to a new wall. We paused, looking at each other over the worn cushions. A silent, shared memory passed between us, of exhaustion, of unspoken invitations, of a life lived in the gray areas. He walked around the couch, came to my side, and wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. "We don't need this anymore," he said quietly, his voice a low rumble against my back. He wasn't talking about the piece of furniture. He was talking about the need for excuses, for half-truths, for hiding places. And he was right. The new normal we were building was one of quiet certainty. It was in the way he started leaving a toothbrush in my bathroom, and then a few shirts in my closet, slowly, organically colonizing my space until it became our space. It was in the easy way we moved around each other in my small kitchen, making breakfast in a comfortable, practiced dance. It was in the way we could sit in silence for an hour, reading or working, and feel not a void, but a deep and abiding connection. The grand, terrifying passion of that first kiss had settled into a gentle, steady warmth, a quiet flame that was far more sustainable, far more real. We had moved past the climax of the story and had found our way into the quiet, beautiful, unfolding narrative of a shared life. We learn, I think, that a home is not a place. It is not four walls and a roof. It is a feeling of being seen, of being known so completely that you can finally lay down your armor. It is the profound peace of finding a safe harbor in another person's heart. For years, I had offered Liam a sanctuary, a quiet room where he could rest. But in the aftermath of our fear and our honesty, he had offered me something far greater in return. He had taken down the walls around his own heart and invited me in. We were no longer the quiet observer and the unknowing initiator. We were just Ethan and Liam. And together, in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create, we began to build our home.